I have buried 3 wives, married 1 daughter, and christened more infants of this parish than I can rightly number, but nothing in 5 and 30 years behind the pulpit at St. Aldrich's prepared me for the sight of the Duke of Brindlewood standing on a widow's doorstep for the 11th time in as many weeks, holding his hat in both hands like a boy called before the headmaster, insisting he had come only to collect a music book. I say this with the fondness of a man who watched the whole scheme unfold from the first crooked seed of it, planted by a girl of 16, with more nerve than sense and more sense than she let anyone credit her. Lady Josephine Ashworth Vane was, in that particular autumn, the most transparent conspirator England has ever produced, and I loved her for it then and love her for it still, though she is a marchioness now with children of her own who have inherited her talent for mischief. But I get ahead of myself, as old men do. Let me begin where it began, on a gray Tuesday in October, in the front room of Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell's cottage at the edge of the village, where a piano stood always in tune, and a woman 2 years widowed sat teaching scales to a duke's sister, and did not yet know that her quiet life was about to be invaded, gently and repeatedly, by the last man in the county she expected to want her. I was there that first day, as it happened, having come to discuss the state of the church roof with Mrs. Hartwell, who kept the parish accounts in better order than the sexton ever had. I heard the lesson through the wall, Josephine murdering a Clementi sonatina with the particular violence of the unmusical, and Eleanor's voice, patient and warm, correcting her without once making the girl feel a fool. That was the first thing I noticed about the widow Hartwell. She had a gift for kindness that cost her nothing to give and everything to sustain, for she gave it to a village that mostly forgot she had needs of her own. Her husband, Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell of His Majesty's Navy, had gone down with his ship off the coast of Portugal 2 years before, leaving her a small cottage, a smaller pension, and a piano he had bought her as a wedding gift with money he could ill afford. She had turned that piano into a livelihood, teaching the daughters of tradesmen and, now, the sister of a duke, and she had done it without a word of complaint to anyone, though I had seen her once standing at her window at dusk with an expression I recognized, because I had worn it myself after my first wife died, the particular loneliness of a person who has arranged her whole life so that no one need worry about her. Lady Josephine finished her lesson, gathered her music with the theatrical carelessness of a girl half her age, and departed in the estate carriage. I thought nothing more of it until the following Thursday, when the same carriage returned to the cottage, not with Josephine inside it, but with her brother. I happened to be walking past on my way to visit old Mrs. Prout, whose chest had been troubling her, and so I saw the whole of it. The Duke of Brindlewood, Alastair Ashworth Vane, unfolding himself from the carriage with the stiff reluctance of a man attending a hanging, informed by his sister's note, which he held between 2 fingers as though it might bite him, that she had left her music book on the widow's pianoforte, and that he, being the only member of the household with nothing better to do that afternoon, must fetch it before her lesson on Saturday. Now, I had known Alastair since he was a boy in short coats, and I can tell you he was never a warm child, precisely, thoughtful, yes, and loyal to a fault, but guarded in the way of boys who inherit too much too young. His father had died when Alastair was 21, leaving him a dukedom, a mountain of debts his father had left to rot, and a mother who did not long survive her husband's passing. He had spent a decade putting Brindlewood back together stone by stone and shilling by shilling, and the effort had worn a certain briskness into him that the village, not unkindly, called thorns. He did not suffer fools. He did not suffer flattery. He did not, so far as anyone knew, suffer much of anything gladly except his sister, upon whom he doted with a fierceness that surprised strangers who had heard only of his reputation. So when he knocked upon Eleanor Hartwell's door that Thursday afternoon, hat in hand, jaw set with the particular grimness of a man performing an errand beneath his dignity, I confess I lingered by the hedge to watch, for I suspected, correctly, as it turned out, that I was about to witness the opening move of a campaign. "Your Grace." Eleanor opened the door with flour on her apron, for she had been baking, and I saw her color rise slightly at finding a duke on her step rather than the stable boy she'd expected. "I was not told to expect callers." "Nor was I told to expect to be one," he said, with a dryness that might have been mistaken for rudeness by anyone who did not know him. "But my sister has misplaced her music, and insists I am the only creature in Brindlewood at liberty to retrieve it." "Ah," Eleanor's mouth twitched. She was already, I think, beginning to see through it, being no fool herself. "Then you had better come in, Your Grace, before the whole village decides we are conducting an affair on my doorstep." He went in. I did not follow, having some remaining shred of discretion, but I heard from Mrs. Prout's girl, who had been fetching water at the well across the lane, that the Duke of Brindlewood remained in the widow's front room the better part of 40 minutes, though the retrieval of a single music book might reasonably have taken 40 seconds. He left, I am told, with the book under his arm and an expression on his face that the girl described as queer, like he'd swallowed something he didn't expect to like the taste of. I did not think much more of it until the following week, when Josephine's scarf turned up missing after her lesson, and the Duke was again dispatched, this time by his sister's very direct insistence that she could not possibly send a servant, for the scarf had been a gift from their late mother and required a gentle hand. By the third such incident, a page of sheet music this time, a Haydn adagio Eleanor had copied out in her own careful hand for Josephine's practice. I had begun to keep a private tally, and I was not alone. Mrs. Prout kept one. The blacksmith's wife kept one. By November, the entire village of Little Aldwych had organized itself, without a word of official coordination, into a covert society for the observation of the Duke of Brindlewood's remarkably frequent errands to the widow's cottage. And I do not exaggerate when I say that attendance at my Sunday sermons that autumn was buoyed considerably by parishioners, hoping to catch some fresh intelligence in the churchyard afterward. I confess I indulged the girl. Josephine came to me one evening. I dined at Brindlewood perhaps twice a month, being an old friend of the family and godfather, in the informal sense, to both children, and found me alone in the library while her brother saw to some estate business. She settled herself into the chair opposite mine, with the particular determination of a conspirator seeking an ally. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, she had never in her life called me Reverend, and I had long since given up correcting her. "Do you think my brother has noticed?" "Noticed what precisely?" I asked, though I knew. "That I have been losing things." She said this with such perfect gravity that I nearly laughed aloud, at Mrs. Hartwell's. "I expect a man does not become a duke without learning to count," I said. "And your brother has counted a scarf, a music book, and a sheet of Haydn in the space of 3 weeks, all left at the same cottage, all requiring his personal retrieval. I should think even a less observant man than your brother might begin to draw conclusions." Josephine's face fell only slightly before recovering into stubborn resolve. "But he keeps going." "That," I said, "is the interesting part." And it was, for Alistair was not a stupid man, nor an unobservant one, quite the opposite. I have no doubt he saw through his sister's scheme by the second visit at the very latest, and yet he continued to answer her summons with a punctuality that a busy duke, burdened with an estate and tenants and the endless correspondence of his rank, had no earthly reason to spare. When I asked him once, over brandy, why he troubled himself so, given that he plainly knew what his sister was about, he regarded me with the particular flatness he reserved for questions he found either too obvious or too dangerous to answer honestly. "It costs me nothing," he said, "to indulge her. She has had a hard enough time of it since our parents died. If she wishes to imagine herself a matchmaker, I can spare an afternoon." "And is there nothing in it for you," I asked, "beyond brotherly indulgence?" He looked at me for a long moment, and something crossed his face that I recognized, because I had seen it in my own mirror once, many years before, in the early days of courting my first wife. A kind of startled resistance, the look of a man discovering a door in a wall he had thought solid. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said carefully, "is a sensible woman. It is a relief some days to speak with someone who does not want anything from me." I did not press him further that night, for I had learned long ago that Alastair Ashworth Vane, like a spooked horse, was better coaxed than driven. But I noted the answer, and I noted, too, that he had used her name without the courtesy title, a small slip that told me more than a page of confession would have. Visits went on through November and into the raw gray heart of December. I will not recount everyone, for that would try even my patience, let alone yours, but I will tell you of a few that mattered, because a courtship, even one so heavily engineered by a 16-year-old conspirator, does not proceed by scarves and sheet music alone. It proceeds by small moments, the kind that pass almost unnoticed at the time and only later reveal themselves as the hinges upon which two lives turned. The first such moment came in late November, when the Duke arrived to fetch Josephine's chosen misplaced object. That week was a hair ribbon, a detail I confess strained credulity even for her most ardent supporters in the village, and found Alina not baking, not teaching, but sitting alone at the pianoforte in the fading afternoon light, playing something slow and private that she stopped the moment she heard his step at the door. "Don't stop on my account," he said, before he had even properly greeted her, which surprised them both, I think, in equal measure. "It's nothing, Your Grace, only an old habit. My husband liked a particular song, and I play it sometimes when the house is too quiet." She said this lightly, the way she said everything difficult, as though the weight of it might be borne more easily if she refused to let it show. "It is foolish sentiment. Pay it no mind." "It is not foolish," he said, and something in his voice made her look up at him properly, "to keep faith with the dead. I do the same with my father's ledgers, though God knows there is little sentiment in a ledger." She laughed then, surprised into it, and Alina told me this herself much later, when the whole story could be told with laughter rather than caution. He looked so startled by his own attempt at levity that she laughed harder still, and by the time the laughter faded they had somehow moved from the door to the piano bench, and he had asked her, with the awkward formality of a man unused to asking for anything, whether she might play the song again. She did. He stayed the better part of an hour, listening, and left that day without the hair ribbon at all, having entirely forgotten what he had come to fetch. The second moment I witnessed with my own eyes, for I had come to call at the cottage myself that December afternoon, on the pretext of parish business, though I confess my true purpose was curiosity, a vice the collar does not entirely cure. I arrived to find the Duke already there, and Alina showing him, of all things, how properly to hold a teacup without looking as though he meant to crush it, a small joke between them that suggested an intimacy already well established beneath the excuse of errands. "You will ruin my reputation for severity," he said, "if word gets about that the Thorn Duke takes his tea with his little finger extended like a dowager." "Your reputation for severity," Alina said, pouring, "survived a dozen visits to fetch a scarf that was never lost in the first place. I think it can survive a teacup." He went very still at that, and I watched his face with the particular attention of a man who has spent his life reading the truth beneath what people say in church. "You knew," he said. "Your Grace, I have taught piano to half the daughters in this village. I know when a child has practiced and when she has not, and I certainly know when a 16-year-old girl has developed a sudden and remarkable talent for losing the same 3 items in rotation." Alina's eyes were bright with amusement, but there was something gentler beneath it, a carefulness, as though she were treading near a subject that might wound if handled roughly. "I did not think it my place to say so. She is fond of you, and I think she is fond of the notion of seeing you happy." "And do you think," he said, and here his voice lost its usual dry armor entirely, "that I have been happy these last weeks." Elinor did not answer at once. I saw her hand still upon the teapot, saw the color rise in her face, saw the particular carefulness of a woman who has learned that hope is a luxury she cannot always afford, having buried one future already and built a modest, guarded peace atop the wreckage of it. "I think," she said finally, "that your grace has visited my cottage 11 times in 2 months for a girl's misplaced trifles, and that a man so occupied with his estate does not typically find so many idle afternoons, unless he is looking for a reason to spend them somewhere in particular." It was as close to an accusation of courtship as either of them had come, and I watched Alistair's face for the flinch I half expected, the retreat of a proud man caught out, but instead he set down his own teacup, with more care than his size and temper generally allowed him, and said, quite simply, "I have not been looking for a reason, Mrs. Hartwell. I stopped needing one after the 3rd visit. I have simply not permitted myself to examine why I kept coming regardless." I will confess that I made my excuses shortly after this exchange and let myself out, for even an old vicar knows when a room requires privacy more than it requires witnesses, and I did not wish to be the reason either of them retreated into propriety before the moment could ripen into something honest. But ripen it did not all at once, for two people so careful of their own hearts do not simply tumble into confession because a teacup has been set down with feeling. There followed, instead, a strange and lovely stretch of weeks in which the pretenses grew thinner and thinner without either party quite admitting they had become unnecessary. Josephine continued to lose objects with undiminished enthusiasm. I recall a particularly audacious week in which she claimed to have left behind not 1 but 2 items, requiring, she insisted with a perfectly straight face, 2 separate trips, and Alistair continued to fetch them, though by Christmas he had stopped pretending, even to himself, that the errands were anything but an excuse he was grateful his sister kept manufacturing. It was Josephine herself who came to me in the 2nd week of December, in something very near a panic, and it is this scene I remember most fondly of the whole affair, for it showed me the girl's scheme was never mere mischief. It was love, the fierce protective love a younger sister bears a brother she has watched carry too much for too long, and she had staked her own small campaign of deception upon the hope that he might, for once, carry something that made him lighter rather than heavier. "Mr. Whitcomb," she said, finding me at the parsonage on a bitter gray afternoon with snow threatening, "I think I have ruined everything. Sit down, child, and tell me what catastrophe has befallen the house of Ashworth Vane this time." "Aunt Cordelia is coming for Christmas." She said this as though announcing an invading army, which, in the particular architecture of that family, was not far from the truth. Cordelia, Dowager Countess of Farrington, was Alistair's aunt on his mother's side, a woman of formidable opinions and formidable connections, who had made it her life's mission since the old Duke's death to see her nephew married to some suitably titled young woman of her own choosing. She has already written twice this autumn about the Fenwick girl, and if she arrives and finds Alistair has been spending his afternoons at a music teacher's cottage. "A widow's cottage," I said gently, "belonging to a woman your brother has, unless I am very much mistaken, come to care for a great deal." "I know that," Josephine said, with the particular impatience of the young for the obtuseness of their elders. "That is rather the point of the whole scheme, Mr. Whitcomb. Do try to keep up." But Aunt Cordelia will not see it as I do. She will see a widow of no fortune and no connections, and she will make Alistair's life a misery over it. And Alistair, when his life is made a misery, retreats into himself like a tortoise, and then he will stop going to the cottage at all, and Mrs. Hartwell will believe he has simply lost interest, and it will all have been for nothing. I confess I had not credited the girl with quite so clear an understanding of the stakes, nor so accurate a reading of her brother's temperament, and I told her so. "I am not a child," she said, with some heat. "I have watched him since Mama and Papa died. He does not let himself want things, Mr. Whitcomb. He decided a long time ago that wanting things was how you got hurt, and so he simply doesn't. Except with me. And now, I think, except with her. I only wanted him to notice that he was allowed." It is not often that a girl of 16 instructs a vicar of 35 years' service in the theology of the human heart, but I will admit she had the truth of it more completely than I might have managed myself, and I told her plainly that whatever came of Aunt Cordelia's visit, she had done a good and loving thing, and that love, once planted, does not generally die merely because a dowager countess disapproves of the soil. Aunt Cordelia arrived 3 days before Christmas, and I attended the Brindlewood Christmas gathering that year as I had attended every one for a decade, and I can report to you now, as an eyewitness, precisely how the matter came to its resolution before what the county would later describe, with considerable relish, as a shocked and murmuring society. The gathering was not small. Brindlewood at Christmas drew the better part of the county's gentry, and Alastair, for all his reputation for prickliness, kept a generous table and a generously lit house, so that the ballroom that year glittered with candles and holly, and the particular anticipation of guests who sensed, correctly, that something was afoot, for the village gossip concerning the Duke's errands had by now traveled well beyond Little Aldwych. Eleanor Hartwell had been invited. I learned later that the invitation had been Josephine's doing, executed with a forger's skill in her brother's own hand before he could think better of it, though I suspect, given what followed, he would not have objected even had he been asked outright. She came in a gown that was neither fashionable nor humble, a soft gray silk that had likely been remade twice over from a garment older than her marriage, and she wore it with the particular dignity of a woman who knows precisely what she is and refuses to apologize for it. I watched her arrive. I watched the room notice her arrival, the way a room notices anything unfamiliar in a familiar setting, with a ripple of glances and lowered voices. I watched Aunt Cordelia's eyebrow rise a fraction of an inch, which in that formidable woman constituted an expression of open alarm. And I watched Alastair, who had been standing near the fire in conversation with his steward, turn at the sound of the door and go still in a way that told the whole room, more plainly than any announcement could have, precisely how matters stood. He crossed the room to her directly, without the pretense of first greeting his other guests, which was, for a man of his rank and reputed reserve, itself a kind of declaration. "Mrs. Hartwell." His voice, I noted, had none of its usual dry containment. "I confess I did not expect you. Your sister's invitation was rather difficult to refuse, Your Grace. I understand it arrived with considerable insistence." "My sister," he said, with a glance toward Josephine, who was watching the pair of them from across the room with the transparent delight of an architect observing her building finally stand, "has developed a talent for insistence this autumn that I am only now beginning to fully appreciate." Aunt Cordelia, who had been observing this exchange with the narrowed attention of a woman assembling ammunition, made her approach before the evening was very much older, and I moved near enough to overhear, for I confess I had appointed myself, in my own mind, something of a guardian to the proceedings, having watched them unfold from the very first errand. "Alastair." Cordelia's voice carried the particular chill of aristocratic disapproval. "You will introduce me to your guest." "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," Alastair said, with a steadiness I found, given the circumstances, rather admirable, widow of Lieutenant Thomas Hartwell, who died in service to his country off the coast of Portugal. "Mrs. Hartwell teaches music in the village, and has, this autumn, taught my sister a very great deal more than scales." "I am sure," Cordelia said, in a tone that suggested she was sure of nothing of the kind, "that Mrs. Hartwell is a very worthy woman. But you are a duke, Alastair, and dukes do not." "Aunt Cordelia." His voice did not rise, but something in it hardened, the particular thorn for which the village had named him surfacing now not against Eleanor, but in her defense, which I think surprised no one in that room more than Cordelia herself. I have spent 10 years rebuilding an estate my father left in ruin, paying debts that were not mine to pay, and denying myself very nearly everything a man might reasonably wish for, because I believed it was my duty, and because I did not think I had the right to want more. I have come, this autumn, to a different understanding. I find I am tired of denying myself the one thing that has made these months bearable. If that offends the proprieties, I find I am prepared to bear the offense. The room, which had been engaged in the polite fiction of not listening, abandoned that fiction entirely. I saw Josephine's hand fly to her mouth, whether to stifle a laugh or a sob I could not then tell, and I saw Eleanor go very pale and very still, the stillness of a woman who has spent 2 years guarding her heart so carefully that she does not entirely trust the evidence of her own ears. "Your Grace," she said low, "you owe me no defense. I did not come here to make trouble for you." "You have made no trouble," Alastair said, turning to her fully now, so that whatever remained of the room's pretense at looking elsewhere collapsed entirely, except the trouble of making a guarded man believe, after 10 years of believing otherwise, that he might yet be permitted some happiness of his own choosing. "I have spent 2 months telling myself that I called upon you for my sister's sake, and telling myself that it cost me nothing, and I have been, Mrs. Hartwell, telling myself a very thorough lie." "Alastair," Cordelia said again, sharper now, sensing the tide had turned entirely against her, "consider what you are about to say in front of." "I have considered it," he said. "For 2 months in a village cottage, over tea I did not particularly want and music I found I could not do without. I am done considering, and I would rather speak plainly before this room than spend one more season pretending I do not know my own heart." He turned back to Eleanor, and here, I confess, my old eyes grew unreliably damp, for I have married a great many couples in my time and buried a great many hearts besides, and I do not think I had seen, before or since, a man so thoroughly strip away his own armor in a single public breath. "I do not offer you rescue, Mrs. Hartwell, for you have never needed rescuing. You have built a life of dignity out of what fortune left you, and I have admired that more than I permitted myself to say. I offer you only the truth that I do not wish to spend my remaining seasons receiving reports of misplaced scarves. I wish instead to spend them in your company, honestly sought, if you will permit a stubborn and thorned man the honor of courting you properly, before this entire county, without one further pretense between us." The silence that followed was, I think, the loudest silence I have ever stood inside. Even the musicians, who had been engaged for the evening's dancing, had let their bows fall still. Eleanor's eyes were bright, and her chin, I noticed, had come up in the particular manner of a woman refusing to let her own hope embarrass her. "Your Grace," she said, "I buried a husband I loved dearly, and I promised myself afterward that I would not build my peace upon the hope of any man's return, nor upon any man's rescue, for I had learned that peace built on another person is peace easily shattered. I have spent 2 years building a life I could stand inside alone, and I am proud of it, and I will not pretend otherwise, even now, even to you." "I would not ask you to pretend otherwise," Alastair said. "I would ask only whether there might be room in that life, built so carefully and so well, for a second chance at happiness that does not require you to surrender the peace you built. I do not ask you to need me. I ask only whether you might, in time, want me." It was, I thought, exactly the right thing to say to a woman of Eleanor Hartwell's particular strength, for he had not offered to rescue her from her independence, but to stand beside it, and I watched the last of her guarded stillness soften into something I can only call joy, carefully permitted. "I think," she said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that suddenly breathless room, "that I have wanted you since the second time you came for that scarf, Your Grace, and knew perfectly well it had never been lost at all. The room, which had been holding its breath through the whole exchange, broke at last into a sound somewhere between a gasp and a laugh, and I saw more than one Dowager's fan snap open in scandalized delight, and I saw Aunt Cordelia's mouth work soundlessly for several seconds before she managed, in a considerably reduced voice, to say that she supposed she would have to revise her opinion of the Fenwick girls' prospects elsewhere. But it was Josephine's voice that rang loudest over the general commotion, for she had abandoned all pretense of decorum entirely and crossed the ballroom at something very near a run, seizing Aline's hands in both of hers. "I told you," she said, half laughing, half in tears, "I told you it was never really about the scarf." "You told me nothing of the kind," Aline said, laughing now too. "You told me it was a family heirloom that required a gentle hand." "Well," Josephine glanced at her brother, who had taken Aline's hand from his sister's grip with the particular gravity of a man who does not intend to relinquish it again any time soon. "It required a gentle hand. I merely arranged for the hand to be his." I will confess I laughed aloud at that, as did half the room, and even Alistair, thorned and reserved as he had been the whole of his adult life, permitted himself the sort of unguarded laughter I had not heard from him since he was a boy, before the weight of a dukedom, and a father's debts had taught him to measure every feeling before he let it show. The dancing resumed shortly after, though I noticed that neither Alistair nor Aline took much part in it beyond a single turn about the floor, the two of them content instead to stand near the great hearth in quiet conversation while the rest of the company whirled past, and I confess I found myself drawn, in the hour that followed, into a conversation of my own that I think belongs to this account. For it concerns a woman who had watched the whole affair unfold with rather more complicated feelings than the general delight of the room. Mrs. Prudence Delacroix, a widow herself and a long-time friend of Aline's late mother-in-law, drew me aside near the punch table with the particular directness of a woman who had known me long enough to dispense with pleasantries. "You look very satisfied with yourself, Mr. Whitcomb, for a man who has done nothing but watch." "I have done a great deal of watching," I said, "which is not nothing in a village where watching is very nearly an occupation." She smiled, but there was a shadow behind it. "I am glad for Aline, truly I am. She has earned whatever happiness comes to her after what she suffered when Thomas died, and I do not begrudge her a duke's devotion. But I confess I wonder whether the county will be as generous as this room appears tonight, once the candles are out and the wine has worn off, and they have had a fortnight to remember that she is, whatever her virtues, a lieutenant's widow with no fortune to speak of." I had wondered the same thing myself, if I am honest, for I had lived long enough to know that a ballroom's enthusiasm and a county's settled opinion are not always the same creature, and that the warmth of one evening does not guarantee the warmth of a decade of dinners and calls to come. "I think," I said, "that the county will follow wherever the Duke leads it, as counties generally do, and I think Alistair Ashworth-Vane has made his position tonight so plainly and so publicly that any hostess foolish enough to slight his wife will find herself very quickly without a duke at her table, and a county without its duke's custom is a county that soon learns better manners." "You are cynical for a vicar." "I am observant for a vicar," I said, "which I have found serves the parish rather better than cynicism, though the two are cousins closely enough acquainted that I sometimes forget which is which." Mrs. Delacroix laughed at that softly, and confessed that she hoped I was right. For she had grown fond of Aline over the 2 years of her widowhood, and did not like to think of her stepping from one kind of loneliness into another merely dressed in finer silk. It was, I thought, a fair worry, and one I did not dismiss lightly, for a title does not dissolve a lifetime of careful self-reliance, nor does it guarantee that a new household will prove kinder than an old solitude. But I had watched Alistair Ashworth-Vane closely enough that autumn to trust that whatever else he was thorned, proud, slow to unguard himself. He was not a man who did anything by half measures once he had committed to it, and I told Mrs. Delacroix as much, and left her, I think, somewhat comforted, if not entirely convinced. I mention this exchange not because it changed the course of the evening, for it did not, but because it is easy, in the telling of a happy story, to forget that happy endings are watched over by people who have reason to doubt them, people who have seen fortune turn cruel before and are rightly wary of trusting it twice. Mrs. Delacroix's doubt was, I think, a kind of love too, the same fierce protective love Josephine had shown in her scheming, only worn by an older woman who had learned to expect less of the world and was still, in her heart, hoping to be proven wrong. She was, as it happened, proven entirely wrong, and gladly so, for the county did indeed follow its duke's lead, and within the year Eleanor Ashworth Vane was as settled and as sought-after a hostess as any duchess in the shire, though she never did lose the particular warmth that had first drawn a lonely, thorned young duke to her cottage door under the flimsy pretext of a missing scarf. They were married the following spring, in the church at Little Aldwych rather than in London, for Eleanor asked for a quiet ceremony among the people who had known her as a widow and a teacher before they knew her as a duchess, and Alastair, who I think would have built her a cathedral had she asked it, agreed without a moment's hesitation. I performed the ceremony myself, an honor I do not think I have felt more keenly in all my years at that pulpit, and I will tell you that I have never seen a groom look less like the Thorn Duke of his reputation than Alastair Ashworth Vane did that morning, watching his bride come up the aisle in a gown of pale gold, her chin high, her dignity entirely her own, married not out of rescue nor necessity, but out of a choice freely and joyfully made. Josephine stood as her particular attendant that day, having appointed herself matron of honor in all but name, and I will tell you that, when the register was signed and the church bells rang out over Little Aldwych, she leaned toward me with the same conspirator's gleam she had worn on the very first afternoon I understood what she was about, and whispered, "I shall have to find something else to lose now, Mr. Whitcomb. Do you suppose cook has misplaced the wedding cake?" I told her I rather thought that particular scheme had run its natural and happy course, and that perhaps, for once, she might allow a thing to remain exactly where it belonged. It is a curious thing, growing old in a single parish, to watch the same handful of families weave in and out of one's days for the whole of one's working life, but I do not think any thread of it gave me quite the pleasure of watching Eleanor Hartwell, Eleanor Ashworth Vane, Duchess of Brindlewood, though she never did entirely stop giving the village children their scales lessons, duchess or not, take her rightful place beside a man who had spent a decade believing that duty and happiness could not both be his to claim. I think of it still, some years on, whenever I hear a young pupil murder a Clementi sonatina through the walls of the old cottage, which stands empty now save for the occasional lesson Eleanor still gives out of fondness for the room where it all began. I think of a girl of 16 with a scarf that was never lost, a duke who told himself an errand cost him nothing, and a widow who had built her peace so carefully that she nearly did not let herself notice when a braver, fuller happiness came knocking at her door, 11 times, disguised as a misplaced music book. They say in the village still, when a young man cannot summon the courage to call upon a woman he admires, that he ought to try losing something at her house. I do not know that I entirely approve of the moral as a man of the cloth, but I confess that when I consider the alternative, a duke and a widow circling each other in careful, lonely dignity for the whole of their remaining years, never quite permitting themselves to reach for what each so plainly wanted, I find I cannot fault Josephine's scheming in the slightest. Some hearts, I have come to believe, require a little contrivance before they will admit what they have known all along, and I count myself fortunate beyond measure to have been given, in my long years at that quiet pulpit, a front row seat to watch one particular heart, thorned and guarded as it was, finally consent to bloom. I ought, too, to tell you of a scene I have long kept private, for it concerns a low point in the courtship that the village never learned of, and I think it does both Alastair and Alina more credit than the public triumph at Christmas, precisely because no one was watching. It happened in the first week of December, a fortnight before Aunt Cordelia's arrival, on a day of such bitter cold that I very nearly did not walk out to the cottage at all, and would not have, had Mrs. Prout's girl not come running to the parsonage in some distress to tell me that the Duke's carriage had come and gone from the widow's cottage in less than 5 minutes, and that Mrs. Hartwell had been seen at her window afterward looking, in the girl's words, like she'd been struck. I went at once, for whatever quarrel had occurred, I did not like the sound of it, and I found Alina at her kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold before her, her composure gathered about her like a shawl she had pulled tight against a draught. "He came to return a book of sonatas Josephine had borrowed," she said, before I had even properly seated myself, answering the question I had not yet asked. And I made some foolish remark, meant lightly, about how convenient it was that his sister's carelessness had furnished him so many afternoons away from his ledgers. And she stopped and pressed her lips together, and I saw that whatever had passed between them had wounded her more than she wished to admit. "He took it badly," I said. "He took it as an accusation that he came only out of boredom, or worse, out of some idle duke's amusement at a widow's expense, and he grew very cold, and said that if I believed his visits were nothing more than a diversion from tedium, he would trouble me no further, and then he left. And I do not think, Mr. Whitcomb, that he means to come back." I confess I did not know, in that moment, which of the two had misjudged the other more severely, Alina, for voicing in jest a fear she had plainly been guarding for weeks, that she was nothing more to him than a pleasant way to pass an afternoon, or Alastair, for hearing in her jest an accusation he was too proud and too wounded in his own old places to sit with quietly. I had seen this before, in longer marriages than theirs had yet become, courtships and unions alike undone not by any lack of feeling, but by two careful people mistaking each other's fear for indifference. "He will come back," I said, with more confidence than I entirely felt. "A man does not abandon 11 weeks of scarves and sheet music over one ill-judged remark, unless the remark struck closer to a truth he had not yet made peace with himself." "And what truth is that?" "That he is afraid you will think less of him for wanting you," I said, "when the whole of his life has taught him that wanting things is a weakness a duke cannot afford. You called his devotion an amusement, however lightly meant, and I expect it landed on him like a confirmation of his own worst fear, that a woman as fine as you would never take his feelings seriously, that it must always look, to the world and perhaps even to you, like mere idleness rather than earnest hope." Alina was quiet a long while, turning her cold tea in its cup, and when she spoke again her voice had lost its guarded edge. "I did not mean it as an accusation. I meant it, I think, as armor. If I called it idle amusement first, it could not surprise me later by proving to have been idle amusement all along. I have been afraid, Mr. Whitcomb, since the very first scarf, that I was building hope on sand again, as I did once before, and that the tide would simply come in one day and take it all." "Then tell him that," I said, rather than the jest that wounded him. "I do not think a man like Alastair Ashworth Vane needs a woman who never fears. I think he needs a woman brave enough to name the fear honestly, as you have just named it to me." I do not know that my counsel alone mended what had broken that afternoon, though I would like to think it helped in some small measure, for I called at Brindlewood 2 days later and found Alastair in a black temper in his study, staring at a ledger he was plainly not reading, and I told him much the same thing I had told Alina, that pride mistaken for dignity is a poor bedfellow for a man who has already, whether he admits it or not, given his heart away. He rode to the cottage himself the following morning, without carriage or excuse or any pretense of a lost object at all, and when Alina opened her door to find him standing there empty-handed for the first time since the whole affair began, he told her, as she recounted it to me long afterward, laughing at the memory though it had cost them both a wretched few days to arrive at it, that he had come with nothing to fetch and nothing to return. Only the plain truth that her jest had frightened him, because he had begun to fear it was true, and the fear itself had frightened him more, for he had not permitted himself to fear the loss of anything since his father's debts had taught him that feeling was a luxury he could not afford. "I do not know how to court a woman gently," he told her, "having spent 10 years learning only how to guard an estate. I am asking you to be patient with a man who is out of practice at wanting things, and who very much wants this." Eleanor, for her part, told him plainly what she had told me, that her jest had been armor rather than truth, and that she was equally out of practice at trusting a happiness she had not built with her own 2 hands. They stood a long while in that doorway, I am told, saying very little more, for there are apologies that need no great eloquence, only the courage to be offered at all. And by the time he left that morning, it was understood between them, without any further scarves required, that whatever had frightened them both had been named and forgiven, and would not be permitted to stand between them again. It is this quiet reconciliation, more than the grand scene before the whole county at Christmas, that I have always thought the truer turning point of their courtship, for it is easy enough to declare oneself before a ballroom, once the outcome is already assured by half a season's evident devotion. It is a harder and rarer thing to walk back into a doorway empty-handed, having been rebuffed and stung, and offer nothing but the truth, and I have always credited Alistair the more for that quiet Tuesday morning than for anything he said before Aunt Cordelia's disapproving eye. There is one further scene I have not yet told you, though it belongs properly to that same golden spring, and I think you will forgive an old man his fondness for lingering a moment longer in a story so dear to him. It was some weeks after the wedding, on an ordinary afternoon of no particular occasion, that I called at Brindlewood to return a book Alistair had lent me the previous winter, and found the great house transformed in a manner no amount of new furniture or fresh paint could have accomplished. There was a lightness to it, a warmth in the halls that I do not think the old stone had known since before the late Duke's debts and the long grief that followed his passing. I found Eleanor in the music room that had once belonged to the late Duchess, a room I remembered as handsome but cold, its instrument kept in tune by habit rather than use, for Alistair's mother had died before Josephine was old enough to properly learn from her, and no one since had cared to fill the silence. Eleanor had filled it. She sat now at the grand pianoforte, Josephine beside her on the bench working through a passage of Mozart with far more application than she had ever shown for Clementi, and Alistair stood in the doorway watching them both with an expression so unguarded, so thoroughly disarmed of its old thorns, that I nearly did not recognize him as the same reserved young duke I had known for the better part of 2 decades. "You are neglecting your ledgers, your grace," I said, coming to stand beside him, for I could not resist the small tease. "The ledgers," he said, without taking his eyes from the 2 figures at the piano, "will keep. I have discovered, Whitcomb, that a man may build an estate back from ruin and count it his life's chief accomplishment for a decade, and then discover in a single autumn that his chief accomplishment was never the ledgers at all. And what was it then?" He was quiet a moment, and I watched Eleanor glance up from the keys, catching his eye across the room with the particular unguarded warmth of a woman who no longer needed to guard herself against a hope that had already been so thoroughly and publicly answered. "Learning," he said, "that I was permitted to want something for no better reason than that it made me glad. My sister taught me that, though she would tell you she taught me nothing at all, and only misplaced a great many scarves." "She misplaced nothing," I said. "She found exactly what she was looking for." He smiled then, the real smile, the one the village had never seen before that Christmas, the one that had nothing of the Thorn Duke left in it at all, and crossed the room to sit beside his wife and his sister at the instrument that had once stood silent, and I let myself out quietly, an old man well content, having watched a family mend itself and a lonely widow find, at long last, a home built not upon rescue, but upon a choice made freely, in full view of a shocked and murmuring society, and never once regretted since. I have told this story many times over the years, at christenings and dinners, and the occasional wedding of a young couple who asked the old vicar for some word of wisdom about love, and I always end it the same way, for it is the truest thing I know about the matter. Love rarely announces itself with trumpets. More often it arrives disguised as a misplaced scarf, a forgotten music book, a girl's transparent scheme born of nothing more complicated than wanting her brother to be happy. And if we are fortunate, if we are paying proper attention, we recognize it before the season ends, and we have the courage, thorns and all, to claim it before a watching world.